Nintendo's Game Boy is a rare blind spot in my video game knowledge. I didn't get on board the handheld train until the follow up Game Boy Color, and I haven't gone back and played the titles I missed out on later in life. That is, until now. In June of 2025, I played through a wide selection of Game Boy games on Twitch. This video series is meant to document my first time reactions to many of those different games. I didn't play each game for long, and so these are not meant to be full reviews, but instead are my initial takes after playing these games for between 5 and 10 minutes in most cases. I thought it would be best to begin this series by looking at the games released in 1989, the year the system came out. Or at least look at some of them. While there are about 25 games that were released in 1989, I declined to play the Game Boy's takes on baseball, tennis, golf, beach volleyball, motocross, shogi, Shanghai, mahjong, battleship, pachinko, and its 3 or 4 different takes on Sokoban and Boulder Dash, aka box pushing games. Once you remove all of those board, card, and sports game adaptations, you are left with a far more manageable list. Remove the games only in Japanese, Bugs Bunny's Crazy Castle, as well as a port of Karateka that I couldn't bring myself to try, and you are left with the 6 games we are going to look at right now.
Alleyway.
Alleyway launched with the Game Boy in Japan, North America, and Europe, and it is Atari's breakout, but without the color. A quick aside, I played the majority of these games in black and white, similar to how they would look when played on a Game Boy Color, but I did play some in grayscale, and those that had Super Game Boy support I played using those default color palettes. In a couple of other cases, I turned color on manually in order to better see the game, and I will note those cases when they come up. Anyways, I couldn't force myself to play more than the first 2 levels of Alleyway, so I can't tell you if there are eventually power-ups, but if there are, they waited way too long to introduce them. Otherwise, this is Breakout, no more and no less. If you want to play Breakout on your Game Boy, then this functions. If you don't, and in the year 2025 at the earliest you very likely don't, then there is no reason to play this game.
Super Mario Land.
The second non-sports game that launched alongside the Game Boy in all 3 initial markets, Super Mario Land is a handheld rendition of the classic platformer with a couple of unique twists. Notably, there are levels where Mario flies, maybe in a submarine, and shoots down enemies like something out of a Konami title. Said enemies do not look or behave like their counterparts in other Mario games, and in many cases the enemies seen here are never used again outside of this game. So while the presentation may not make Super Mario Land look or sound like Mario, it certainly plays as polished as you would expect from a Mario title. Mario himself controls like a dream, whether on land or in a ship, and the level design, while definitely noticeably different than Miyamoto's work, is still superb. If it weren't for the Megaton launch title we are about to discuss, this would have been the definitive launch game for the Game Boy. As it is, it served as the definitive launch title in Japan and played second fiddle to this game elsewhere, although as far as how enjoyable the games are to play today, Mario is my pick for the launch title that holds up the best.
Tetris.
It's hard to overstate the importance of Tetris or the brilliance of its design. Many would argue that Tetris is not only the best Game Boy game of all time, but maybe the best video game of all time, full stop. I may not personally go that far, but there is no doubt that no title solidified Nintendo's dominance of the handheld market like Tetris. Still beloved and played with fairly minimal changes to this day, Tetris is the definitive Game Boy experience, although it is worth noting that while the changes made to Tetris in the years since are indeed minimal, they are very noticeable. Most importantly, pieces cannot be rotated for a second after reaching the bottom of the pit, making fitting those tough shapes together far more difficult. There is also no ability to hold a piece for later among more minor additions. While small, the lack of some of these later tweaks makes this a relic of the time period, and there is no real reason to play this version of Tetris over later ones.
Revenge of the Gator.
Released in Japan in October of 1989 and in the US the following March, Revenge of the Gator is an excellent pinball title from Kirby and Smash Bros. Creators HAL Labs. HAL was no stranger to pinball in 1989, having released Pinball Spectacular all the way back in 1982 on the VIC-20. If you don't know what a VIC-20 is, well, this isn't really the video to go into it, but it's a really old computer. They had also released Rollerball on the NES, and also on some other really old computers like the MSX and Sharp X1 between 1985 and 1988. And Revenge of the Gator utilizes many of that game's mechanics and physics, leading to an exceptional pinball game that would in my mind remain unmatched on the platform, outside of HAL's own follow-up, which we'll discuss in a much later video. Also, as promised, I need to mention here that this footage was captured primarily using a palette that I manually applied, which helps quickly distinguish between the different table objects in a fast-moving game like pinball. When played on an original Game Boy screen, I would have to imagine the combination of gray-scale graphics and heavy ghosting would make this a far less playable game, and that is the only reason it is receiving 3 stars instead of 4.
Castlevania The Adventure.
Released later in October of 1989 in Japan, in December of the same year in the US, and in 1991 in parts of Europe, Castlevania The Adventure easily takes the title of the worst game of the system's launch year, at least of the ones we played. Featuring gameplay that runs as slow as molasses, Castlevania might be hard like its NES counterparts, but the difficulty here comes from the sluggish controls and poor level design, not from challenging enemy placement and pattern. That makes it far less fun to deal with, and once again, playing an action game of this sort, especially one that requires fairly precise movement on a screen with as much blurring and ghosting as the Game Boy, means that on actual hardware, I have to imagine this title is nearly impossible. An absolute travesty that sits alongside some of the British computer ports of the first game as the worst traditional Castlevania title.
The Final Fantasy Legend, also known as Saga.
Our final title was released as Saga in December of 1989 in Japan, and in 1990 as The Final Fantasy Legend in the US. Like most early Final Fantasy games, there were no releases outside of those 2 countries. Speaking of the naming difference, Square clearly felt that us dumb Americans couldn't possibly comprehend the existence of an entire second JRPG series from the same company, so they just added it onto the Final Fantasy brand despite this game playing nothing like a Final Fantasy title. The Saga series is an ongoing series that Square continues to release up to this day, and the series is notable for its high level of difficulty and for its wide open design. This is Square making a game much more in the vein of Ultima than the wizardry-inspired Final Fantasy, and like early Ultima, the Saga games all but require the aid of a guide like Nintendo Power in order to progress. As such, I did my best and spent significantly more time with Saga than with any other title in this video, but I did not make much of any progress. If you love early Ultima games that provide you with a large degree of freedom but almost no actual guidance, give the Saga games a shot. You can actually get all 3 Game Boy titles as a collection on the Switch. They are very much not for me as a whole though, and the later games on the Super Nintendo and PlayStation have at least some reasonable quality of life features that make them vaguely bearable, but I cannot really recommend these early titles personally, although I know there are many who do love them. And that does it for episode 1. All told, I played through the openings of several hundred Game Boy games, so expect plenty of additional episodes in the future. Until then, be sure to like the video and subscribe to see those future entries. Thank you all for joining me, and as always, have a great evening.